Hi guys, how are we all? Already have one Q&A, so that's fantastic. So, okay, first Q&A. Will the session be recorded? Yes, it will be. I'm not too sure where it would be available, but I will. I'll make a couple messages and try to get that information by the end of the session. Okay. Just having a look. Got a couple of housekeeping things. Okay. Can you hear me okay though? I'm assuming if I said hello and someone responded with hello, then yeah, should be okay. Just message in the chat if you can hear me okay. Loud and clear. Fantastic. Alrighty. Okay, so welcome to this webinar. We're essentially going to be going through a couple of tips with regards to Section 3 and how to maximize your score in Section 3. So just a little bit of background for myself while people are kind of rolling in. So my name is Abdul Rahman. That's quite difficult for a lot of people to pronounce given my very Muslim background. But I go by Rahman, which was a nickname given to me in high school. Long story, I'll probably just keep it short. But yeah, so I'm currently a second year medical student at the University of Melbourne. Yeah, so got into medicine directly after biomedicine. I sat the GAMSAT once and I scored an overall score of 82 with a 97 in Section 3. So yeah, with regards to this talk specifically, and in terms of what I do at Fraser's, I'm the bio lead at Fraser's, so I'm responsible for a lot of the biology-based content within Section 3, but then I'm also a vetter for the questions, where I look through the questions and make sure they're of utmost standard, utmost quality. That's another part of my role. Anyway, so with that out the way, yeah, so okay, cool. I guess I want you guys to throw in the chat while we wait for more people to roll in. Throw in the chat what you expect to get out of this session. What do you expect to know coming out of this, or certain things that you want me to cover that are kind of outside, and hopefully towards the end of the session, we'll be able to get to some of those questions, some of those key things that, or key themes that a lot of you guys have familiarity with, or a lot of you guys want answered. Yep. So just throw that in the chat, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll get to that as we go. Okay, so we've got how to prepare for Section 3, time strategies in the exam. Fantastic. We'll be touching on that. More effective way to study and improve Section 3 over the few weeks. Yeah, fantastic. Maths without a calculator, how to approach questions, how to also get a 97 in Section 3. Yeah, no. Of course. Trips to approaching questions when time constrained. Of course, yeah, we'll be covering all of that in this session, hopefully. So this session is meant to be a little bit more general, and there's only so much we can do in the time that we have, but I'll try my best to get to everything that we can. Staying focused towards the end of the exam. Fantastic. You need to stay focused, and we'll talk a little bit about focus things, but yeah. Tips to dissect questions. Yep. So we'll be going through a question base, going after we go through the kind of start of the presentation to ensure that we kind of cover most of what I think is most important within the GAMSAT with my experience, both teaching it, but then also doing exceptionally well in it as well. So, yep. And I'm going to be going through a lot of my personal preparation as well for those people that are asking for personal preparation. Okay, fantastic, cool. So it does seem to be in line, or the content that I've got, it does seem to be in line with a lot of what you guys want. Fantastic, good to hear. Alrighty, so let's get started. I'm just going to present my screen, and my computer does a little bit of a kookiness when it comes to me sharing screen. So again, do let me know if you can see everything. Give me one moment to share screen. Present. Yep. So can we see that okay? Can you still hear me okay? Fantastic. Righty. Okay, so top 5 tips on how to maximize your score in Section 3, and we'll cover a lot of the questions that have just come up in the chat as well. Okay, so gave my introduction, so intro's out of the way. With regards to Section 3, I guess first and foremost, like all of you guys would probably know what the GAMSAT is, but just as a as an intro for those that may not know, the GAMSAT is fundamentally a reasoning test that has been put in place for most postgraduate Australian medical schools, and it's a requirement for most postgraduate Australian medical schools, where they require you to sit this test to do reasonably well on it, and then it forms part of a 3-based system where you've got your GPA, your GAMSAT, and your interview, where all 3, based on different weightings, would then give you acceptance to medical school. So the GAMSAT is split up into 3 sections: Section 1, Section 2, and Section 3. Section 1 is testing reasoning in the humanities and social sciences. Notice the word reasoning that I put up there, right? Section 2 is testing your written communication and how well you can articulate your thoughts. And then finally, Section 3, which is why we're here today, is testing reasoning in the biological, chemical, and physical sciences. That's what Section 3 is testing. Yep. Okay. So with regards to how I started my preparation, so just a bit of context, I only sat the GAMSAT once, and I sat it in May 2020 when it switched to the online format. That's the time that I sat it, right? And in that first sit, I was able to score like, a fantastic score. How did I do that? How was it that I was able to just get a score in my first try? Yeah. So at the moment, yeah, slides will change. Yeah, I'm just giving a little bit of background, a little bit of introduction. Yeah. So with regards to how my process kind of looked like, it was identify information. Okay, identify correct information. B, develop a strategy that would help me improve. And then C, ultimately put that strategy in place and modulate it as required so that I can continually see improvements. And that would then ultimately give you, or give me, in this particular case, the best score. And that's exactly what I did, and tried and true, did it, and it worked. Right? Okay. So with regards to the first tips, what was the first thing that I did? My first thing I did: understand the nature of the GAMSAT. Understand the nature of the GAMSAT. What is the GAMSAT? Now, a lot of it's a pretty obvious tip, right? Well, of course, the first thing you need to do before you sit a test is to know what it is. But from tutoring so many students, what I found is that often we don't take the time to read the information that ACER has kind of put out for the GAMSAT. Right? We just go straight into asking all these people all these different questions about how to prepare for this question, how to prepare for Section 3, what the timing is like, but we don't go and assess the freely available information that is present within the ACER booklet. Okay, so what is tip number 1? Read the ACER booklet. Read the official information on the GAMSAT. Yeah. What does it say about the skills? What does it say it's testing? What's the know-how? What's the nitty-gritty? What's this whole test about? Right. That's the first thing I did, because you can go to talk to your friends who've already got into medical school, or talk to someone else who may have done well, maybe ask questions in a webinar like this one, but ultimately the best information you're going to get is straight the source. Yeah. This booklet here, this one here, read it. You read the Okay. Yep. So read every section within this, every section. So each section has an explanation as to what exactly it's testing. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to go straight to Section 3. Right now, in Section 3, it kind of talks about, or within Section 3, it talks about exactly what is required to do well. Yeah. So I'm getting like a lot of, my voice is cutting. I realize this. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. I'll leave my camera off just for the sake of the continuity of the class, and we'll continue from this. So with regards to the ACER booklet, just make sure that you're kind of reading through this booklet. Make sure that you read exactly what it is that it's testing. So if we have a look at what it's testing, it says here, stimulus is presented in a variety of formats, including text, mathematical graphs, tables, and diagrams, right? And it kind of explains absolutely everything within Section 3. It explains a whole range of different skill sets that you need to be across to be able to do well, right? It explains a whole range of skill sets that you need to be across to be able to do well. And what are these skill sets? It tells you testing, reasoning, and problem solving within a scientific context. This section examines the recall and understanding of basic science concepts. So when we talk about theory and studying theory, there's your answer to that question. Often people ask, oh, how much theory do I need to study? What level of theory is required? Yeah, that's a very, very common question. Now, when it comes to that, when it comes to how much theory you've got, yeah, it tells you recall and understanding in addition to testing, reasoning, and problem solving. In other words, reasoning and problem solving is key point number one, but number two is the section is examining recall and understanding of the basic science concepts, right? And then it's examining a whole range of these different skill sets that you guys can have a read through. I'll just kind of cover one of the examples of the skill sets. It says translate knowledge from one form to another. So what does that mean? It means that it's testing my ability to translate knowledge from one format that it might be presented in to another format that it might be presented in, which means when I'm doing questions, what am I thinking about? I'm not thinking about just doing the question blindly. I'm thinking about the skills that the ACER booklet has told me to follow, right? And just as a legal disclaimer, ACER does not endorse any companies. ACER does not endorse phrases at all. Neither does ACER endorse any other GAMSAT companies that exist, right? So it's not endorsed, but this is freely available information. And I'm kind of presenting this to you from that perspective, that it's freely available information and it's information that is useful for GAMSAT preparation. So it kind of lists through everything that you need to know there. So if you've got a good handle on these particular skills that have been listed out here, then you're sitting in very well stead for the GAMSAT. So again, very simple thing to do, but people don't do it. People don't read the information that they've given. They've given a lot of information here. They've given you basically every single skill set across the different domains that are being tested, right? Deducing consequences for models, following and evaluating a line of reasoning. And I'll highlight this as we do a couple questions within this session today. I'll highlight these specific things that we're doing, and I'll highlight how to kind of improve them. Okay, so moving back to the presentation. Okay. I'll put my camera back on and hopefully it doesn't cut out. Okay, so that was tip one. Tip one, read the ACER booklets and make sure that you're over exactly what it is that it's testing. And specifically, what are you trying to read from the ACER booklet? You're trying to identify the skills that they're testing for. Okay, and that then brings you to the second point. Now, this second point is a little bit based on theory, right? So, I've kind of broken it up such that we'll talk about the skill sets later, which is arguably the more important thing within the GAMSAT space. Yeah, to do well in section 3, you need to be a good problem solver, not someone who can recall facts, right? Recalling facts isn't useful. Yeah. It's useful to solve questions, but it's useful to approach questions, but it's not useful to solve questions, right? A little bit of an amendment there. Okay, so what's the second thing that we need to get across? And this is exactly what I did. Okay, so when it came to in my journey, for example, so back in November 2021, because I sat it in I was assuming to sit it in March 2020, but back in November 2019, March 2020. Yeah, I was assuming to sit it in March 2020, but of course they kind of delayed it down to May, and that's when I sat it. So when it came to my personal preparation, I started around November. Yeah, around November. And the first thing I did was read the ACER booklet across all 3 sections. What exactly is it that I'm being tested for? And what I identified from reading the ACER booklet, again, this is not what ACER says. ACER hasn't said this. This is Rahman Abdul's breakdown, right, from what I read. What I found was that it was not testing my theory so much so as it was testing the skills or the application of the information given plus theory. So application of information, not just the information they gave me, but information from theory as well, right? Because the statement was recall and understand basic science concepts. It said basic science concepts. Yeah. What does that mean? It means that when they say year 12 level physics, year 1 level biology, year 1 level chemistry, which is what they've also mentioned in that booklet, they mean the basics within these 3 fields. Year 1 biology, year 1 chemistry, and year 12 physics, right? Year 1, I mean university level, university 1 bio, university 1 chem, and year 12 physics. They mean basic understanding, basic concepts was the wording they used, not advanced concepts. So in year 12 physics, you may have studied, the different arguments for photons, whether they're particles or whether light is a particle, whether light is a wave, and you would have walked through wave equations if you've covered that within physics, right? That's advanced. You don't need to know that. You don't need to know the advanced level, right? But what you do need to know is the basics, right? What is physics in general? What is a force? What is motion in biology? What is a cell? What is a mitochondria? What are organelles? What is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum? Maybe what does it mean to have homeostasis? What is a hormone? What is a peptide? What is a protein? These basic concepts are what you need to be across. But when it comes to advanced concepts, right, they're not that relevant because that advanced information would be given to you. How do I know this? From the ACER booklet. That's what they said, right? So we're just going off what they said. Now, second tip, or the second step in the process, identify your theory learning gaps and create a plan to fill them. How do you do this, right? What do I mean by theory learning gaps? So all of us have a whole range of different backgrounds. What I did, maybe doesn't help you with what you did, right? Look, with what you've studied. So for me in year 12, I did biology in year 12, but year 12 level bio. I did year 12 level chemistry, and I also did year 12 level physics. I did specialist math methods, and the whole STEM, everything to do with like math in year 12. And then I went straight into a bachelor's of biomedicine when I didn't do too well in my interview for undergraduate medicine, right? So I went straight into bachelor's of biomedicine. There I studied bio, there I studied chem, and of course, because I had the first year level biology, first year level chemistry from biomedicine, and I already had the year 12 level physics that I studied. So I already had a very good basis on science. So a lot of the tips that I'd be giving here might be colored from the lens of me already having a good base in science. If you don't have that, then maybe you need a little bit of a different approach, right? So when I say theory learning gaps, for me, I spent maybe 2 weeks revising theory. That's it. So November till like midway November, or maybe till early December. That's it, right? And the theory revision after that point, after those 2 weeks, was mainly guided through doing questions rather than studying theory itself. Okay, so I'm not trying to say the entirety of your prep should be spent studying theory. That's not what the GAMSAT is about, as we just established. It's about those skill sets that are listed within that paragraph there on the ACER booklet. It's so that's what it's about. It's not about the theory. Now, when it comes to studying the theory, let's say you've gone through life and you're a little bit more of a seasoned veteran, so to speak, right? Where you haven't gone straight from year 12 to university. Maybe you took a little bit of a detour. That's okay, right? Maybe it's worthwhile you revising some of that content, or maybe learning some of that content if you haven't already. Yeah. So when it comes to identifying your theory learning gaps, this is very self-introspective. You need to think, okay, what do I know? What am I comfortable in? Have I understood the concepts? Again, remember, basic recall of what? Of concepts, not of facts. So they're not going to ask you, oh, mitochondria produces 36 ATP per cycle of the Krebs cycle. They're not going to ask you that, or neither are you needed to have that information. What you do need to know is, without the mitochondria, the cell will die, because the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Right? The mitochondria is responsible for oxidative phosphorylation, generating ATP to provide energy for the functional processes that occur within the cell. It's a factoid, but it's something functional. It's something you can apply, not how much ATP. Does that make sense? So we're thinking about concept, not fact. That's what you need to think about revising if you were to revise. And again, not too much, maybe 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks if you have a science background. If you don't have a science background, then of course, it'll be a little bit longer than that. But once you've got a handle on concept, then then you're in good stead. Then I'd say at that point, move on to doing questions. So chip away one at a time, right? Make sure you use reliable information to understand what you need to know. What do I mean by this? Don't just go off the word of some person, or even myself. Don't just go, oh, Rahman said do this, right? No. Do your own research as to what is the syllabus for year 12 physics, for example. That seems to be one of the most common things that people haven't studied, year 12 physics, right? So in that case, what would I do if I was in that position? I'd go to the Heinemann Year 12 textbook, which was the textbook that my school, Sirius College, used, right? I'd go to that textbook and I'd look at the area of studies for each of the topics, and I'd say, this is the topic. It says kinetic motion, kinetics and forces. The other one says vectors. The other one says, I don't know, light theory or wave theory, right? Then I'd say, okay, let me understand wave theory. Let me understand the basics of light and what it is and what, how it functions, basics of force, basics of kinetic motion and whatnot, right? So you're going there. With regards to bio and chemistry, year one, or, for year one level, how would you go about learning the concept? Think, ACER knows that not everyone goes to the same university, that there are multiple universities in Australia and they all have slightly differing syllabuses, right? So Therefore, probably something that's going to be smart for you to do would be to go to your friends who are at Monash, who are at Melbourne, who are at Griffith or other places, go through the learning objectives that they have there within their slides. Again, not every single learning objectives, but the big picture learning points for year one biology, year one chemistry, and look at the similarities, because the similarities are probably what you need to know, and they're probably the most important. That's something you can do to study your theory. Again, I've labored the point of theory a little bit here, but it's the least or the lowest yield thing you can do for section 3 of the GAMSAT. Don't spend too much time on this. Go into the questions and getting that reasoning, developing that reasoning, that's the most important. But although this is a prerequisite, which is why I've mentioned it and I've labored the point on it. Okay. So any questions on what I've just mentioned so far with regards to tip 1 was kind of self-explanatory, but step 2 specifically, the learning gaps and creating a plan to fill them. Any particular questions? Can you hear me still? Yep. Okay, fantastic. Great. I was like freaking out, like, oh my God, has it been like 10 minutes of me talking without anyone realizing anything? Yeah. So recommended textbooks that can help with the biology and chemistry content. Okay, so my university process, right, do it at Monash. So I did my bachelor's of biomed at Monash. I was very much against textbooks, right? So I didn't use the textbooks. All I did was use the slides that they gave, and also looked at the subject handbook. So that was a fantastic place to go. Subject handbook, Monash subject handbook, biology, right? And in that, they kind of go through each of the overall overarching learning outcomes, and I used that to kind of base my preparation. Right. So with regards to recommended textbooks, I won't be able to give you any because I personally didn't use any. I just used the Monash model, and that helped me. Now you've got your own university, and it doesn't matter what university you use. I'd probably say it's safer to stay within the Australian-based universities. But again, that's just me. If you're in the UK and if you're overseas, there's a question that's just come up in the chat. If you're overseas, are they easily accessible? You should be easily able to access some of them. So I'm going to stop my video because it kind of stuffs up when I do this. But yeah, so if I click this, I go Monash Biology Year 1 Subject Handbook. Level 1 science units, right? So you might want to go directly to something like not conservation biology, something specific, but you want to go something to like, let's say Monash, so biomedicine, and then we go into like a subject like BMS 1011, for example. There's your handbook, available for absolutely free for everybody, right? It tells you what you're going to be learning, the overview. It gives you all of the learning outcomes you need to know. Yeah, it gives you these big, broad picture learning outcomes. And then you can kind of look at those and say, all right, I need to understand these. That's what that looks like for this particular subject, right? And that's for biomedical chemistry. Then maybe you want to then look at something like another one of the units. So again, this is really based on the fact that you guys are all at university and would have your own curriculums. All you need to do is go to the handbook and have a look at the big picture stuff in the learning outcomes, and that will give you a pretty good idea as to what you need to be, the concepts you need to be aware of to get on that. Okay. Yeah. So this is something that something I didn't necessarily do, but the thought did cross my mind to look at the learning outcomes. So I did it on one of the days. I did a quick brief overview to make sure that I've understood the key learning outcomes for each of the subjects. Because again, I did this when I finished my first year. I did SAT to GAMSAT in my second year of biomed. So I already finished first year content and I was already well over it because I did well in university. Right. Okay. So that's a little bit about tip 2 with regards to textbooks and whatnot. And as questions come, keep throwing them in the chat. Yeah, keep throwing them in the chat. Okay. And then, yep. Okay, cool. So another question's come up. What other free resources other than phrases would you recommend for section 3 specifically when it comes to doing questions? So Des O'Neill questions are still available. They're still kind of floating around. Use them. They're a little bit old school. So we'll talk a little bit about, okay, you know what, we'll keep that point because it's going to come in the next point anyway. Okay, cool. We'll talk a little bit about that. With GAMSAT 6 weeks away, do you think we can realistically get a high score chipping away at the content review right now? If you're GAMSAT 6 weeks away, honestly, very much depends on where you're at. If you have zero science knowledge at all, then it might be worthwhile to do like maybe a week. It might be worthwhile to do maybe a week of review. If you've got no science knowledge at all, then but it really is dependent on your individual circumstance. I'll leave my email in the chat if you want to email me specifically, and we can kind of tailor a study guide for you, if time permits. Okay, if you come from a non-science background, how long should you spend on learning theory? It's a very subjective question, Jemima. I do appreciate that you asked that question, though. The question, basically, the answer to it is it depends. Again, like, I can't tell you how long you should spend on learning theory if you come from a non-science background, because it depends on how quick you are when it comes to learning science. Some people take ages, other people take a short amount of time, right? So it really depends on where you're at that level. So it might come from maybe 2 to 3 weeks to maybe a month or 2 months, or maybe 3 months, but I wouldn't say anything more than 3 months for anyone to get the concepts down if you're doing that full time. Okay, so we'll move on to step number 3 now. Okay, so once we've got that kind of once we have the theory down, or even if you don't have the entire theory down, let's say you've got a pretty good understanding of biochem and physics, right? A pretty good understanding. Yeah. So that what I mean by that is you understand the concepts of what a cell is. What is a protein? What is a carbon atom? What does it mean when we talk about valence electrons? What is that concept? What is the concept of ionic bonding? What is the concept of valence bonding? What is the concept of metallic bonding? What is the concept of force? What is a force? What is torque? All of those kind of big picture base level concepts, if you've got them down, then you move into doing practice questions. So what is step number 3 or tip 3? Developing the necessary logical reasoning and management skills. We're going to go through a couple questions to kind of reinforce this later as well. So don't worry too much if it seems a little abstract now. But remember, again, what are we doing questions for? We're doing questions to develop the necessary logical reasoning and management skills. You're not doing the questions to get them right. Not yet. Right? So if you get a question wrong, don't be like, got it wrong, right? Because that's not helpful to you at all, right? If you get depressed because you're getting questions wrong all the time, that's not helpful to you if you kind of linger on that, if you dwell on it, right? You need to get out of that mindset of getting upset because you're getting questions wrong, to think, hey, this is a completely new environment. It's a completely new test that's testing a new range of skills that have never been tested before, right? So it's okay if you get like 10% or even 0% of the questions right. That's okay. You're entering this new realm, right? It's expected that that's going to be the case, right? So you're not trying to get questions right, but you're trying to develop the skills needed to get the question right. Yeah. And then that brings us to step 2 and 3. Is the reason I've repeated them. Use a high quality database of questions and understand the limitations of the questions you are using. This is vital. Okay. There's a lot of resources for GAMSAT out there, whether it be phrases, whether it be ACE's own papers, whether it be, Des O'Neill, whether it be, a whole range of different companies, right? And a whole range of different tutors themselves as well. A lot of medical students make their own questions and give them out, right? At the end of the day, you need to understand the limitations of those questions. What are those limitations? ACER has had they've been trialing these questions for years. They've got a good database on the questions, and they have a good amount or good idea of what the questions are like. And these questions are made by literally professionals who do that full time. Okay, they're literally people that dedicate their entire lives to making impeccable logical reasoning assessment questions. Impeccable. Yeah. As compared to any company, any any booklet at all, right? Any of those, as compared to those where it might be a couple medical students, maybe a couple doctors who sat down and made a couple questions, and then had maybe 5 or 6 people review that question to see whether it's okay, which is still good. It's still fantastic, of course, right? But there's a limitation to that, isn't it? Because sometimes mistakes will weed through, or sometimes there'll be a little bit of a subjectivity within the question, where section 3 is meant to be objective. What do I mean by subjectivity? Maybe the wording is a little bit ambiguous, and that leads you to a wrong conclusion, even though you're applying correct logical reasoning. That does happen sometimes, right? So you need to understand the limitations of the questions you're using. If you get a question wrong, and it might be a fault with the question, if that's the case, cool, leave it, move on. Try to extract the reasoning and develop the reasoning through the question. Again, that's why getting the questions right or wrong isn't actually useful. What's useful is developing that reasoning, right? And we'll go through a couple examples of how to do that. Okay. So step 4. Don't practice for the sake of practice. So once I've mentioned doing practice questions, that doesn't mean, okay, I think the answer is A. The next question, I think the answer is B. Next question, I think the answer is C. Next question, I think the answer is A again, right? That isn't useful, is it? Because you're just doing questions blindly and you're not really reflecting on your performance. So when we talk about developing the logical reasoning skills, right, and management skills, right? We're talking about actually reflecting on your performance so that you're able to identify where you went wrong or where you went right, and how to then optimize that, how to optimize your skill sets, how to optimize what you've got to make it better, or how to work on something that you've never worked on before to at least make it of an acceptable standard. Yeah. So and we'll go through again a couple practice questions to explain that in a little bit more detail. So then that brings us to the next tip, right? Reflect on everything. Development. So someone mentioned in this chat, there was one of the questions was, how do you develop the skills? How do you build on problem solving skills? Yeah. It all comes down to reflection. That's the magic word. If anything you get from today, reflection, 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 reflection. What do I, so in, within the GAMSAT space, when we say reflection, what we're talking about is an understanding of not just how to solve the question, right, but how you solved the question the first time you did it, and the psychology behind why you chose the certain answer options you chose, right? So what that means is you're trying to reflect on questions you got right. You're trying to reflect on questions you got wrong, questions that were too scary to attempt, questions you were completely lost for, the emotions that you were feeling when you were doing particular questions. You're trying to reflect on all of that. You're trying to identify why things happened the way that they happened and how you can then best or then you work with someone or work in a group or even by yourself to develop a kind of strategy that would then help you to solve that particular problem. Yeah. And that process of in-depth reflection is how you, again, not anyone else, me telling you how to do well in the GAMSAT isn't going to help you, because I'm telling you how I did well in the GAMSAT. My background is in specialist mathematics, math methods, and all of these different things. Right. I was brought up on math since my birth. Right. My dad was like, mathematics, you get that math down. So the way I thought about section 3 was through a mathematical kind of perspective. Right. So even the questions that were based on words, I would substitute words for variables. I did the same thing in section 1, by the way. Right. Section 1, there were a whole range of different words, and I was like, yo, this is a bit too, it's a bit too much for me. Right. Section 2 is just a little bit too much for me. I think probably what's best for me then is to actually think through like maybe add variables to a lot of the terminology that's used there. So if there's a definition, I'll say X is defined as this, Y is defined as this, things like that. So that's where my brain was, mathematics based, right? So me telling you how I did well isn't necessarily going to help you do well. You need to figure that out for yourself. That's what the reflection process is for. I can show you how I reflected, but the way you reflect might actually be a little bit different as well. Yeah, because each person, each individual is different. Each individual's cognitive ability is different. Not worse or better, no, just different. Yeah, people think differently, and because they think differently, the only way you're going to get the max score from the stuff that you've got is by optimizing the skills that you have, or optimizing what it is that you can already do. Yeah. So identify your learning gaps in cognitive skills, which is what section 3 of the GAMSAT is testing. And again, I'm just reiterating, every person is different. Step 3. So within reflecting on everything, keep a record of your learning outcomes. Let's say you learned something new after doing a question. Keep a record of that. So, okay, this is something that I learned from this particular question. That's an actionable solution that I've generated that I can apply to other questions. Let me just write that down somewhere. Or if you're not going to write it down, at least kind of bake it into your subconscious so that you're doing that for every similar type of question that comes up again. Yeah. And there's going to be, we'll talk a little bit about this as we do a question set towards the end of this class. Now, this reflection process is probably one of the hardest things for you to master, right? It's very difficult because A, you've probably never done something like this before, right? And B, once you've mastered the skill, it honestly like changes your life because you start to think about everything. You think about the interaction you had with a certain salesperson. You think about the interaction you may have had with someone who's a little bit affrontational. You think about conflict resolution. You think about everything because you're reflecting on every experience you had, and that is what allows for like exponential growth in not just the GAMSAT but things outside of that as well, right? But kind of bringing it back to the GAMSAT, you don't have to do thousands and thousands of questions, right? It's not about how many questions you do. It's about what the quality was or how much you took out of every question, right? I have friends who maybe did 600 questions, right? Just around 600, which is still a large number. And they scored in the 80s for section 3, just because they took so much out of every question they did. Yeah. So that's an extremely important point. And it's a very hard bit to master. I'll try to go through a couple of tips as we go through a question to show you what I mean by these things, right? So, but what ultimately the point that you're trying to get to is once you start noticing patterns in your answering habits, right, you can start to reinforce the good habits you have. Let's say, for example, when you look at a graph, the first thing you look at is the axes. That's a fantastic habit because often the tricks are going to be within the axes. So you say, right, okay, there's a trick there within the axes. I'll just focus on the axes there. Right? If that is the case, then that's a good habit. You want to reinforce that. But let's say one of the bad habits you have is when there's a niched detail that's mentioned in the GAMSAT. Maybe they're talking about these older reactions, and maybe they're talking about the specific mechanism by which this occurred, and then the history behind how it occurred. Or how someone discovered it. If you start focusing in on those specific details that aren't helping you solve questions, maybe you notice that. Maybe you notice that's a habit of yours because maybe by nature you're a curious person. You want to know what that's talking about. If that's the case, you want to get rid of that habit. The only way you're going to get rid of a bad habit is by acknowledging that it's a problem. Yeah, you have to acknowledge that that is something that you're doing that isn't helpful to you solving questions in the future, and therefore is something that you need to remove. Yeah. So you reinforce good habits, and not only do you identify your bad habits, but you also form strategies against those bad reasoning techniques, right? Which would then enable you to stop you from making them, which would then increase your accuracy. And again, I keep saying that we're going to go through a couple of example questions. You're probably sick of me going through that, but yeah, we'll do that. Okay, the final tip before we get to the questions, right? And this is probably one of the biggest things for me that like transformed the way in which I thought about the GAMSAT. And this was kind of credit goes to Dr. Scott Fraser. He spoke about this in a masterclass that I attended, and in that masterclass was this whole concept of a growth mindset. What it means to grow, to think about the GAMSAT as an opportunity rather than a challenge, right? So often the typical kind of medical student would, or someone who's a pre-med student would think about challenges, things to overcome, right? As an obstacle. It's something that I need to just get done and move on, right? But too little do we see them as opportunities to test ourselves, to get better, right? To develop certain skill sets that might actually help us in our future careers, right? Too little do we think about things like that, right? So it's you've got to stop seeing challenges like the GAMSAT as an obstacle. Rather, you want to see it as an opportunity. Yeah. And what does that do? It enables you to think about a particular challenge with enthusiasm rather than dread. So you're not thinking, oh my God, it's the GAMSAT. You're thinking, oh my God, it's the GAMSAT. Fantastic. Right. And that shift, it's something that really helped me because it made GAMSAT study enjoyable. Why? Because I told myself that the skills that I'm learning through studying the GAMSAT, the skills I'm learning here are definitely going to be important for me as a clinician in the future, as a medical professional in the future. These skills that I'm developing through this test, it's not just going to stop at the GAMSAT. It's going to go through medical school. And for those, you can ask your mates in medical school when they're going to tell you about a particular class they have called problem-based learning or PBLs. Some of them have case-supported learnings or CSLs. It goes by a variety of different names, but essentially what it looks like is you're given a case of a hypothetical patient that's based on a real patient, and your job is to then work with your team, you and your group, to diagnose that patient. Look through the different conditions they have, research on the same time. All of those things are based on logical reasoning and problem solving. They came with a set of symptoms. Your job is now to try to connect the dots and find out what exactly they have. Yeah, that I was amazing at CSLs. That was probably the highlight of MD1 and even moving now into MD2 as well. Right, because I could just connect the things together, and reflecting on that was me identifying that the GAMSAT is what helped me do that. Just studying for the GAMSAT the way I did was really good in developing the skill sets that I needed to be a good diagnostician, which is essentially what you need to be a good doctor, right? So when it comes to diagnostics, think about the STEMs as a patient. You say, this is my patient, I need to find out an answer to their particular problem, and they've given me a problem. Yeah. If you start taking that kind of approach, you start to then think logically. You start to think, try to connect dots as much as you can, right? So again, think about watching a lecture in engineering mathematics versus watching your favorite movie. Obviously, through your favorite movie, you'd be a lot more enthusiastic and a lot more focused on what exactly is going on as compared to your lecture in engineering mathematics, where they might be talking about differentials. And unless you like engineering mathematics, I'm putting my own bias here because I absolutely despise engineering mathematics. It's just too crazy. But yeah, like if that's something that you like, then of course you'd be enthusiastic in that. So at this point, if you enjoy the time that you spend on something, you're more likely to do well. So it's helping you do well in the GAMSAT anyway. right? Take each STEM as an opportunity to improve the skill sets that you have. Think of it from improvement perspective, not from a oh, I need to do this to get into med school perspective, right? Think of it as this is a longevity thing. I'm trying to get into med school. Maybe I won't get the best score in the GAMSAT now. In the next 6 weeks, maybe I won't get the best score, but that's okay. That's fine. I'll sit it again and I'll learn all the stuff that I've learned so far. I'll continue building on that until I'm able to get a good enough score, right? That process of thinking in that longevity and thinking about growth from that perspective is I think tantamount to doing extremely well in the GAMSAT, right? So while I was sitting my section 3, especially section 3, section 1 and 2 meh, but section 3, when I was sitting it, I was having fun. I enjoyed sitting section 3. It was a fantastic experience because I got to see how much I had developed all of these skills. I got to see them come into play when it came to those questions, right? And it was a great feeling, you know. Yeah. So remember, this growth mindset would absolutely hold you in fantastic stead through medical school, as well as through life as a future doctor as well. Okay, cool. So we've talked a lot about, question banks and question resources and doing questions. Now let's kind of go through a set of questions that are going to help us think about the skill sets, think about the process. Yeah. Okay. So let's get on to some questions. So before we do, just wanted to give a little bit of a, go through the course material. So at Frasers, we have, when you purchase a pack, you get access to a question bank. So this question bank is just filled with many different questions that you can do that are broken down based on skill type, based on the specific skill that you want to test for. And that way it's kind of helping you isolate specific skills for you to test. And I think that this was fantastic. I didn't have this back when I was sitting it. So, but the way that it's kind of structured now is you might be able to, let's say, pick a topic. Let's say you go with physics. Yeah. Let's say you want to do physics questions, or let's say you didn't even want to do a specific kind of thing. Let's say you go with biology or physics or chemistry. Let's say physics, and let's say you wanted to practice your mathematical reasoning, right? So you can either practice based on theoretical kind of breakdown. So if you want to practice questions on sound, or practice questions on energy, or practice questions on materials, you could do that too. But the more high yield thing to do would be to practice based on skill sets. So things like formula and calculation based questions, questions where you need to compare information and interpolate, questions where you need, let's say, visual analysis and whatnot. So let's say you go with formula and calculation based questions. You can kind of select whether it's practice, right? So whether you want feedback given after every question, or whether you want it in an exam kind of mode where results are going to be shown after you answer a set of questions. The length could be short, medium, long, or even extra long. So if you want to do 100 questions total, if you want to do maybe a long one, if you want to do maybe a medium-sized one, or maybe you want to do a short one, just 10 questions, right? So let's say you wanted to do a certain set of questions, you open this up, you press start, and then you're given this particular question here, right? So I've never seen this question before, but I'm thinking, you know what, let's use it as an opportunity to demonstrate reasoning skills. Okay, and then we'll go through a different STEM as well that's a little bit more math heavy. Okay, so here's a particular question that's been given to us. Yeah, so let's say this is A, so they've given us this particular question, right? So we can kind of also move through the quiz controls. Oh, that's nifty. Okay, cool. But yeah, so we're given this STEM here, and we're given this particular question. So I'm going to have a read of the question, and I'm going to vocalize my thought process as I go through this question, just so that you're able to see what I mean by reflection and reflecting on the process and thinking about how to improve answers, right? So first bit, cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless fluid found in and around the brain. Okay, so first sentence is a definition. They've given me a definition of what CSF is. I might have already known this in the past. I might not have known it because it's a niched kind of bit of neurology. I might not have covered this in the past, but that's okay. They've told me what it is. It's a clear, colorless fluid. It surrounds the brain. It serves many purposes. One of them is to increase the buoyancy of the brain, which helps protect it from damage. So let me think about that logically. I've got a bucket, but the bucket is my skull, this noggin, right? So this noggin is the bucket. Inside the bucket, we've got some fluid, and inside the fluid is a little brain, just like floating around there, right? That's what I've got. So if I move my head around, the brain is going in the fluid, right? So now I've got a visualization of what they mean by increasing the buoyancy. It's making it floaty and bubbly. It's not just stick and hard. Otherwise, it's going to cause damage if I move it around, right? There you go. Then it says a brain of volume 1.4 liters. So they've already specified a value. So in my mind, I'm thinking, why bother specifying a value? That's 100% going to be important in some sort of calculation base, right? Or maybe it's there to throw me off. I'm not really thinking about what it's there for. I'm thinking that it's there. I'm just registering that they've given me a value for this. So that can help in solving the question. It's submerged in a container filled with CSF and floats partially above the surface. Okay, so it's floating partially above the surface and partially below the surface. And then it tells me such that 7% of the volume is exposed above the surface of the fluid. Okay, so again, what I'm doing is I'm kind of sketching this out. Yeah. So this is my brain, right? You've got a brain volume. It's submerged in this container. So this is a container. Let's say this is a container. Whoopsie daisy. Clear the drawings. That's our container. We've got a brain in here that's of volume 1.4 liters. It's filled in a container with CSF, right? And the CSF is 1.4 liters, right? And then it says it's floating partially above the surface, such that this represents 7%, which also means, so there's two parts of information here. There's the explicit 7% of the volume, and then there's the implicit, which is 93% is inside the fluid, right? That's an implicit piece of information. They haven't told us that specifically, but it's implied through logic, right? So 93% is submerged, right? It's exposed above the surface of the liquid. Now, why bother giving me this percentage? I'm already thinking this is probably something that we need to connect together, right? It's probably something that we need to kind of start going through it. So yeah, okay, with Rowena's question, is the CSF or brain 1.4 liters? I want you to have a read of it. Read it and read it carefully. This is a learning point, by the way. How do we know? It tells you a brain of volume 1.4 liters, right? Yep. So in that particular case, this drawing would probably be a fantastic point there. So this isn't 1.4 liters of cerebrospinal fluid. This is referring to the brain's volume. This volume of CSF is, we don't know, because we don't know how big the container is. We don't know any of those things, right? And then it gives me something about Archimedes' principle that states the buoyant forces of equal magnitude in the opposite direction to the weight of the displaced fluid. Okay, so I don't care what the name of the principle is. I don't give a crap, honestly, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is the principle that they've kind of demonstrated to me here, right? And by the way, how did I get to this level of being able to break things down in this way? It's all through practice, 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 practice. Identify what's more important, what information is less important, categorize the information, make it easier for yourself. So in this particular case, what do we have? We've got the buoyant forces of equal magnitude and of opposite direction. Okay, so we got buoyant force, which is force kind of allowing it to float, equal magnitude, so it's equal to the weight force, but opposite in direction to the weight of the displaced fluid. So the amount of fluid that has been displaced due to the brain entering. Okay, and it can be expressed in this particular equation. Fantastic. And so I'm not going to look at the equation because I know that it's there and it's just talking about density and volume and gravity. So then we go to the question. Question says, given that the density of CSF is 1 gram per mil, the mass of the brain is closest to. All right, cool. Right. So we're given this question. We've broken down the information given to us. We spent a couple minutes doing that. Now we're given this particular question. Let's try to understand this question, right? They've given me density in the question. Given that the density is this. So in my brain, alarm bells ringing. Alarm bells ringing. What are they ringing for? The fact that they've given me density here as well. They've said something about density in the equation. So the fact that they've given me density in the question is indicating that I must use this equation, or it's not really must, but it's indicating with a high level of certainty that that equation is probably relevant for this question. Yeah. So in terms of categorizing information, that information has now risen to the top. This is probably going to be the most important piece of information in solving this question. Then it says the mass of the brain. What we're noticing is that there's no mass here, is there? Huh. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect density to mass. There needs to be a way to connect those two things based on the stem, right? So let me think, is there any way that we can do that? They said something about weight in the stem, didn't they? They said the weight of the displaced fluid, right? What is weight? And I want some of you guys to throw this in the chat, just get a little bit more engagement going. You're probably sick of hearing my voice. But yeah, what is weight? Does anyone know the equation for weight? Yeah, weight, because it's a force value, it's a mass times an acceleration. Weight is equal to mass times gravity, right? What's that? That's exactly what we're looking for, isn't it? So logically, what have I done? I haven't calculated anything. There's no calculation yet. This process was me figuring out a potential mechanism to solve the question. Okay, this process was problem solving, connecting dots, putting pieces of information together. right? So if I was to kind of talk about what exactly I did here, I was comparing information and I was interpolating, which is one of the skills that are within phrases that we've kind of adapted from the ACER booklet. Yeah, it's a skill that we teach in our content, and it's a skill that's been adapted from the booklet because it goes into translating knowledge from one form to another, etc., and a whole range of the different skills that I mentioned there. It encompasses a lot of those, right? So what are we doing here? Weight is equal to mass times gravity. So therefore, we know that when this brain is put into the cerebrospinal fluid, it's got a weight, and it tells us that the buoyant force, which is what we can calculate, is equal to the weight in this particular situation. So if I think about it, all I have to do is find the buoyant force, equate it to the weight, and then I've got my answer, because gravity is 10, as stated. Yeah. So what I've done is I've generated a way to solve the question without actually solving the question. So that's skill number one. What's skill number two? Skill number two is mathematical reasoning, actually applying the math and making estimations. That's the second skill, right? Now, I did so much practice that I'm proficient enough to know that the answer here is probably going to be B, right? But let's see if that's the case. And I'll explain how I got to that like in an instant. Right, so here's what we did. So with regards to this particular question, the force of buoyancy is equal to the density, which they've given as 1 gram per mil. I'm noticing the unit. Why bother giving me the unit? So 1 gram per mil multiplied by the volume, which is 1.4 liters, right? But that's not the actual volume, is it? Right? The actual volume is only 93% of 1.4. How do I know this? Because only 93% is responsible for displacing the fluid. Yeah. Does that make sense how I'm connecting the stuff that the STEM says to actually applying it to the question? I'm applying it to the scenario they've given me, and then I'm using that to solve the question. It's an application of information, not just information itself. Yeah. So in this particular case, 93% is here, right? So what's 93% of 1.4? I have no idea. I don't know how to calculate that off the top of my head. So what am I going to do? I'm going to estimate it. 90% of 1.4. Right, 10% of 1. So there's 7% here, 93%, 1.4. I'd probably say it's about 1.3. Rough estimate, right? Rough estimate about 1.3, which seems reasonable in the grand scheme of estimation. So it's about 1.3 liters. But I used mil here, didn't I? So therefore, I've got to convert this to mil, 1,300 mil, right? So 1 times 1,300 times gravity is going to equal to mass times gravity. Gravity cancels out. Therefore, the mass is equal to 1 gram per mil times, so 1 gram per mil times 300 mil. Think about the units now. Think about the units. Grams per mil multiplied by mil. What does that give you? Grams. Fantastic. It just gives you grams. And that's exactly what the question's asking for. It's asking for the mass of the brain, isn't it? So 1,300 grams is exactly 1.3 kilos. And that's how you get your answer there, right? So let's see if we were correct here. So let me just remove these annotations because they're in the way. Okay, so 1.3 grams per liter, click, submit answer. And did we get in, is this because we did it in exam mode? Yeah, I think it's because we did it in exam mode. Okay, but yeah, I could probably just, for the sake of seeing whether it's right or not, I'm just going to select whatever. Let's go to here. Yeah, so that's my mistake. Shouldn't have selected it in exam mode. But yeah, so it should have selected in practice mode. But just to see the answer to that question, I want to see if it's right. It should be, because, and notice how I'm very confident this is right. I've never seen this question before, but I'm very confident, right? I might be wrong. You never know. I might have missed some piece of information, and that's okay. View results. And where is the breakdown questions? Here we go. See, got the first question right. Okay, with a very high level of certainty in solving that particular question. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that kind of brought a little bit of kind of attention to some of the questions. And I think we'll probably try a different STEM as well. So let's do this one here. Okay. So we're given this particular question, and I'm only going to go through this one question, and we're really going to reflect on the question as well. Yeah. So we're going to reflect on the question. Okay. So key things I want you guys to note when I went through that question, right? All of the stuff that I didn't know how to do when I first started preparation. I started to recognize the key pieces of information and the ability to connect things. The more practice I did, the more reflection I did. So let's say I did that question, I got 1.3 as the correct answer. I'd look through the explanation and I'd say, right, was my reasoning the same as the reasoning they gave? If it was, great, I'm doing good. If it's not, was my reasoning better? Because I got the question right. Yeah, remember, I got the question right. Was my reasoning better or was my reasoning completely wrong and I just happened to get the right answer? Right, asking myself all of these questions, and I'd be comparing my reasoning to the answer once I got the answer to see how I went. Right, and in doing so, I would identify, okay, this is a particular mistake that I made. Let's say I didn't think to link the weight and the buoyancy force together. Let's say that's a mistake that I made. If that's the case, then right, how can I make those kind of links better? Let me generate an actionable solution in doing so. So maybe, right, if I'm given a piece of information that talks about a force, maybe I can think about other forces that exist that are similar to it. So maybe the next time I get a question that is maybe about the force of a planet, right, I can think, okay, it's the force of a planet, but at the end of the day, it's still a force. So it'll still be mass and it'll still be acceleration, right? Those kind of things. Yeah, that's a reflection that I've taken out of that particular question. Okay. Yeah, this webinar might actually go a little bit over time, but that's okay. For those of you that want to go, you can, but like stick around because it's free. It's free help. I don't know why you wouldn't stick around. But yeah, so okay. So let's kind of go through this particular stem as well. Questions 1 to 10. The loudness of sound perceived by humans is related to the intensity of the sound wave by the following formula. So they've given me, so even without just reading through this, they've given me a relationship between loudness and intensity. I'm not going to worry about this relationship so far, but they've given me a relationship here. Then it says an example of common sounds on the decibel scale is shown below. Sound intensity level at 1000 hertz is 20 decibels, 40 decibels, 60 decibels, 80 decibels, etc., etc. Right? It then says the loudness of a sound wave is reduced the further away it gets from the source. Okay, that's a relationship, isn't it? Right? Because they're connecting two pieces of information together. So yeah, they're connecting two pieces of information together. The loudness of a sound, and they're connecting it to distance. It's reduced the further it gets from the source. This is because the intensity of a sound wave is inversely proportional to the distance squared from the source. Okay, that's another relation. That's an extension on the initial relationship. So the intensity of a sound wave is inversely proportional to the distance squared. So if I have a sound wave of magnitude 1, right? And then I move 2 meters, and I move a meter ahead. I doubled the distance, in other words, right? Then that intensity is not going to half. It's going to become a quarter of what it was, the distance squared, right, from the source. And that's the kind of progression that they're going through. And they've kind of also indicated that relationship in an equation here, where they've given me this. And then they've said this part here: in an amphitheater, a sound wave of 1000 hertz is produced from a speaker. At a certain distance away from the speaker, the loudness is measured to be 35 decibels, and they've given me this conversion factor. Right? And I'm thinking, why would you give me this conversion factor? Right? There's a reason for it. It's probably involved in some of the questions. Alrighty. Okay, so let's get to the question now. Question says, what is the intensity of the sound measured in the amphitheater? So again, there's two parts to this kind of question, right? I'm already thinking, even just because they've asked about intensity, right? We're thinking, first, make a process. They're trying to get us to calculate a value. B, right? And because they're trying to get us to calculate a value, there's going to be two steps to this. The first bit is going to be find a process to get to the answer. The second step is going to be enact the process, right? This is a strategy that I developed from my practice that I did, from the reflections that I did. It's a strategy that I developed that would help me get these kind of questions, right? It's a strategy that I developed to help me keep my mind level-headed during the GAMSAT when it comes to mathematical reasoning type questions. Yeah. First, find a process to get to the answer, then calculate. Because through finding a process, you can find shortcuts. And you never know, we might actually find a shortcut here as well. So the process I'm thinking is they've asked me for intensity. They've given me loudness. Okay, loudness, they've asked me for intensity. The thing that connects these two facts together is this equation. So I know this equation is probably going to be the most important equation, right? The loudness is 35, right? And that's going to equal to 10 log of I on I naught. So what I need to do, I'm just writing this out to explain it to you guys. But in the GAMSAT, I wouldn't be writing this out. I'd be kind of first going through and making the process. But what I need to do is I need to rearrange this equation. They've given me IO. All I need to do is rearrange the equation and find I, and I've got my answer. Now comes the second part of the question, actually applying the mathematical reasoning to it. Yeah, actually applying the mathematical reasoning to it. So let's go and do that. So in this particular question, right, applying the mathematical reasoning to it. So we got 10 log to the base 10, right? Because whenever a log is given, it's log to the base 10. So that's an example of prior knowledge that you need to know. Whenever a log is given without a base value in the log, you assume that it's log to the base 10, right? So rearrange this. We get 3.5 is equal to log to the base 10 of I on I naught. Notice how I'm not putting in the value for I naught yet. Yeah. Then we go, okay, 10 to the power of 3.5. Okay, that's equal to I on I naught. And now I'm going to input I naught's value, 10 to the power of negative 12. And then if we kind of rearrange that, we get I is equal to 1 times 10 to the power of negative 8.5. Yeah. And now we're stuck in this dilemma here where we don't know what the answer is going to be, right? Because we calculated this value, but it doesn't match any of these ones. Right. And often this is where when I was first doing practice for the GAMSAT, maybe 2 months in, I'd give up on the question because I was like, oh, I've applied the logic. I haven't got the right answer. So let's see and move on. Right. That's a stupid mindset because I did all this work and I'm not going to get the question right anyway. What's the point? Right. So through my reflection, I identified that, okay, so what do I mean by reflection? I would think with these kind of questions, I think, okay, what can I do to make this better? Right. And what I could do is I could think about not calculating, but instead estimating the math. Yeah. And estimation is then a skill that I developed through thinking about the question from that perspective. So in this particular case, right, 1 times 10 to the power of minus 8.5. We know that's not going to be D, right? It can't be D, right? Can it be C? Maybe. Can it be B? Maybe. Can it be A? Maybe. Right? But it can't be D because D is 10 to the power of 15. That's clearly not the case. It's clearly a negative value, right? So D is gone. Now we're left with a 33% chance of getting it right. Let's see what happens. So in this particular case, we know 1 times 10 to the power of negative 8.5. 1 times 10 to the power of negative 9 would be a value that is smaller than this, right? 1 times 10 to the power of negative 8 would be a value that is greater than this value. So therefore, it can't actually be C either, because C is a value that is times 10 to the power of negative 8. That's a value that is at least 0.5 of a magnitude higher than what we've got, right? Now, if I was to convert this to a value, so we got 1 times 10 to the power of negative 8.5. And I want you to think through the math with me here, right? If this becomes 1 times 10 to the power of negative 9, then that's a value that's definitely smaller than this value. So it can't be 1 times 10 to the power of negative 9. So it must be the 1 must change. If we're going to keep because we've counted up C and D, we're left between B and A, and both of them have 10 to the power of negative 9 as their substituent. And therefore, because both have 10 to the power of negative 9 as their substituent, we're thinking, okay, there must be one of the values, one must change to a value greater than itself. So if you, for example, had 9 times 10 to the power of negative 9, then let's say you had 10 times 10 to the power of negative 9, that would end up being 10 to the power of negative 8, right? So we're now working with changing this value. And how far would it change? And that then goes into the definition of 10 to the power of negative 0.5, because that's the difference between these. So 10 to the power of negative root 5.5 is basically square root 10. And that's closest to square root 9, which is 3. So it's going to be a value closest to 3, which is why A is the answer. Right? So that's a mathematical reasoning technique there. Didn't actually calculate anything, but still figured out what the answer was going to be. Yeah. So just to re-explain that, the number we got was this. Where we were stuck was making a decision as to what that number would represent if you were to make it into these terms. We cancelled out D because that can't be the value. We cancelled out C because C is too great of a number. It's not negative 8, it's negative 8.5. So if anything, it's going to be negative 9, which is 1 order magnitude smaller, but with a greater multiplier. Yeah. To get the multiplier, I separated out the 8.5 to 0.5. So 10 to the power of negative 0.5 is the same thing as saying 10 to the power of negative a half. And when we raise something to the power of a half, it's the same thing as saying square root 10, right? So if you're doing square root 10, we know that square root 9 is 3. So square root 10 must be closest to 3, which is why A is the answer. It's closest to 3, right? Now, if we were to, again, I haven't done this question before, but I'm fairly certain A would be the answer based on the logic there. And oh, thank God, I don't look like an idiot. Yeah, got it right. Fantastic. Now, what would what's the, so through that whole entire process, and I'm sure like if we could look through this, they probably have a different way of solving it, but we'll see. Yep, so they got to the same point as 10 to the power of negative 8.5. Oh, perfect. That's exactly how I did it as well, right? Split it up into negative 0.5 and negative 8. Negative 0.5 is square root 1 on 10, and there you go. You got your answer. Okay. So question here. So a couple questions in the thing. I get how you've estimated the answer, but why did the initial approach not result in the answer? That's part of the trick in the question. It's part like that's the GAMSAT does that. The GAMSAT gives you the logic, you find the answer, you follow through the logic, and it doesn't give you the answer because it's not one of the multiple choice answer options. So that's a trick within the particular question. Yeah, it's a trick in the question because they could very easily put 1 times 10 to the power of negative 8.5 as one of the answer options here, but they haven't, right? They didn't because they want you to think through estimation. They want you to be able to estimate. That's another skill they're testing. Why? Because it says it in the ACER booklet. It says estimation and interpolation. That's the wording they use there, right? So notice how a lot of this is becoming the skills. And how did we identify the skills? Based on the ACER booklet and then also the adapted version, which is what we do at Phrases. Again, just to clarify, ACER does not endorse GAMSAT companies in general. They don't endorse it. That's the legal kind of perspective of ACER. Okay, cool. So that there represents so that particular question. I think we're kind of out of time now, but hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight as to what the reflection process looks like and how the reflection process is so powerful in helping you get questions correct, right? And helping you develop the reasoning base. So all that estimation stuff, because I did thousands of questions before this question, right? That was all about estimation and reasoning. And that's where I got to, right? Thinking about estimation through breaking the 10 to the power of negative 8.5 into 10 to the power of negative 8.5 times 10 to the power of negative 8, things like that. Okay. Alrighty. So, okay, cool. And with that, I will quickly share screen. So until Sunday. So by the way, a lot of what we taught here, a lot of what I've covered here is covered in the GAMSAT Essentials packages as well as a whole lot of the different phrases packages. So if you're someone who's struggling and you're someone who thinks that you would benefit with this kind of teaching, one-on-one teaching as well as teaching with this kind of process, then that's something that you can do if you'd like. Obligations to do so. It's not like, oh, we preference any students or whatever. This information is just there to help as many people as we can, because that's what our ethos is at Phrases. Access the recording and slides. I'll quickly message to see whether or not that is an option. Give me one moment. Okay. Cool. Which resources did I use for my question bank? So what I did was I didn't do the phrases course formally. I say formally because a lot of the phrases tutors, like I had a lot of help from that. So a lot of the phrases tutors did help me because I was mates with them. but yeah. So with regards to the question banks I used Des O'Neill. Right, I recognize that Des O'Neill is kind of an inferior quality resource, but I used it just so that I could practice the skills. It's fantastic to practice the skills. And that's the kind of point that I was trying to make up here. I was trying to say, understand the limitations of the questions you're using. If the questions are old or they're a little bit too easy, still try to develop the skills that you need from those questions because the questions are questions, but recognize the limitation. Recognize they're not going to be the same as the exam, right? I also did phrases mocks, which I thought were fantastic. I thought that the questions here were really good. They were really good, not just for similarity to the GAMSAT, in fact, the phrases questions I probably say are a little bit harder than the GAMSAT, and we do that on purpose because we want to put you in that deep end so that when you get to the actual exam, you're like, oh, this isn't that bad, right? Which is a good place to be. Some questions coming up in the Q&A as well. Okay, so what do we got here? So just before the Q&A question there, I want to quickly look through this particular question here in the chat. It's too much time trying to get to the answer after you get them wrong. Because so Haley, fantastic. That's exactly what you should be trying to do. You should be once you've got the answer to the question, right? You should be, let's say you got it wrong. Just look at the answer to the question and then try to figure it out. That process that you're doing, that's really good. That's exactly what I used to do in my preparation. Now, you spending too much time trying to get to the answer to the questions, that's fine, because that time is you trialing and you're putting in trial different approaches to the same question. It might take you half an hour, it might take you 45 minutes, it might even take you an hour. right? Don't worry about that. Why? Because the reasoning that you're developing as you do that process, right? That time is well spent. Yeah. You I'm a big advocate for 10 questions with reflection is way better than thousands without. Right? If you do 10 questions across multiple skill sets with adequate reflection, the amount of high yield learning you're going to get out of that is going to be so much better than if you did 1,000 questions without thinking about reflection. Yeah. So yes, like the fact that you're spending too much time trying to get to the answer questions, that's good. That's good because you're developing the logic as you go through. You're like, once you finally get to the answer, you're like, that's what they were saying. And the next time you see a question of similar logic or testing a similar reasoning type, you're going to be like, okay, it's similar to what that one question that I did, right? Which is great. Nikki has another question. Break down the number. Yeah, so you can break down the number as to, however you'd like, and you'd still get the same answer. Yeah, so you do need to sign up to Phrases course to access the question bank that I was using. I think this question bank is fantastic. Why? Because a lot of the questions there, well, not a lot of them, but some of them, a good chunk of them, I made myself, and I had them vetted with 6 other tutors who scored very highly in section 3, and they kind of went and did the questions themselves and figured out whether or not the question was of high quality. And often we have way more questions than what's already up on the question bank, but we don't put them up on the question bank because we're not happy with the quality of the questions. So like, with regards to the question quality and the vetting process, because I'm personally involved in it, I can attest to the fact that it's very good. Yeah. Okay. So just till Sunday, we've got a discount of about 10%, I think, across all the packages, or at least with the GAMSAT Essentials package, and we'll get to that. Okay. So for the whole recording, it would be, so I've just got word from one of the leads here. The recording will be available on YouTube with the slides. They'll see whether they're going to make that available, but the recording will definitely be available on YouTube. Does the Essentials package include the section 1 and 2 resources? So if you were to go to the Phrases kind of website, right, it'll tell you, whoops, GAMSAT. It'll tell you exactly what's involved in the thing itself. So if you go to courses, if you go to the Essentials package, for example, then you can look through the actual Essentials course, and it'll tell you exactly what's within it. So you've got your question bank for section 1 and 2, and you've got a whole lot there. A complete mock exam, different the atlas that we've kind of customly made to help curate responses towards yourself there. So I think it's in terms of whether it's a temporary access, I think it's an access until the GAMSAT season is ended, and then if you aren't able to get that as great of a score you want, I think you have access to that question bank again. And the reason why it's only a temporary access over that is because we keep updating it with new content, right? Which takes obviously time, money, and effort. With regards to whether I did a lot of mock exams, yes, I did. I did as many as I could. Often, like after the first 2 months of me doing questions to develop the reasoning, I spent 2 months trying to develop the reasoning. And then after I did that, so 2 months to try to develop the section 3 logical reasoning process. Once I did that, then I went straight into timed mock exams because I also wanted to reflect on how tired I get, how fatigued I get when I say entire mock exams, like an entire GAMSAT. I wanted to simulate the GAMSAT. I even went so far as the way I studied for university was the same timing as the GAMSAT, right? So like I was like very extra with regards to timing because I really wanted to make sure that timing I was cognitively active for the entire process. The mocks, so I got the mocks from Phrases. I got a couple mocks from the Des O'Neill has mocks themselves, and I used the ACER questions, of which there are like about 200 or so. I made them into mocks for myself too. So someone wanted an answer to Kaya's question, but so if you could repost your question into the question Q&A thing, then we could do that there. 6 weeks out from the exam, is the Essentials worth it? I think it is personally, because you're getting all of those questions, you're doing all of those questions, and like it's just it's an access to a high quality question bank that you can reflect with questions on, and the questions are of the quality that I've just shown you there. Really helps you develop that reasoning that you need to be able to do well there. Okay, so let's get to the Q&A questions now. How many time management, how many hours per day or week should we aim for learning content versus questions? It's a fantastic question, but of course, as I've kind of explained before, it really depends on how much time you have. For me, full-time uni student, had no work commitments. I basically, my parents were like, okay, you like in terms of like family commitments, I had a lot. Just, cultural things. The people who are from a similar cultural background to me would understand. But you know, I kind of told them, hey, I need this at least these 2 months. Just kind of ask my brother to help with the computer stuff, just because I need to really focus down here. So that's what I did. So in my case, I was studying maybe 6 to 8 hours a day, because I could, right, and because I enjoyed it. Now, how long did I personally take to prep for the first sitting? So I started thinking about prepping for it since, what was it? Back in 2019. It would have been September 2019. I spent 3 months wasting time, just did nothing. And then November is when I kicked into gear. So that would have been 4 months of preparation, of solid preparation. The recording will be available on YouTube, so you guys can watch this at your own leisure. And so these questions are there. And for re-explaining the questions, the recordings are available on YouTube, so you can go and look at those. In terms of whether it's too late to join the comprehensive course, I don't think, like, you know, you can join it whenever you'd like. Maybe wait to join it in the next sitting, just because, you know, you want to get the full experience. But yeah. So maybe wait to join the next sitting. But if you wanted to purchase it now, you can do that as well. It's just, you know, because the comprehensive course has a guarantee that if you don't get a good enough score in the GAMSAT here to get you into med school, then you can resit the comprehensive course again free of charge. Any advice during the GAMSAT exam, how to maintain your stamina? Take short breaks and really enjoy it, man. Like, enjoy the process, enjoy learning, right? As a medical doctor, you're going to be someone who's going to be learning on a daily basis forever. Like, your learning never stops, right? So just enjoy learning about new things. Just be curious, enjoy. If you enjoy sitting the GAMSAT, you won't get tired. Simple as that, right? So I didn't really enjoy section 2, to be honest, just because I don't like writing. So that's probably reflected in my score as well, where my lowest section score was section 2. But section 1 and section 3, I enjoyed quite massively, and that's why I did really well in those 2 sections. So what are the limitations to the ACER questions? The ACER questions are very easy, in my opinion. Again, this is my opinion. I think that they're very easy. I think that the GAMSAT is more difficult. I think the phrases questions are even more difficult than the GAMSAT itself, but the ACER questions are definitely way too easy. They do help you develop some reasoning skills though, and they help you get accustomed to the format of the question, so they are still worth doing, I think. Yep. So that's that question there. So here question here, what percentage on practice exams roughly equates to a good GAMSAT section 3 score? Right, that's a great question. I wouldn't be able to answer that, but I can give you anecdotal experience. Towards the end of my preparation, I was at about 75 to 90% of questions correct, right? Towards the end of my practice. Towards the start, I was around like maybe 40 to 50%. But as I improved, that's where I was at. Now, this is very variable because yes, I scored a 97 in section 3, but one of my mates had like a 53% on practice exams, and he got an 88 for section 3. So, you know, it really just goes to show how much variability there is, and it's that the percentage of questions you get right does not correlate at all, or not necessarily at all, but does not correlate with the answer that you get, or the actual exam score that you get. Advice for section 2, buddy, you do not want me to give advice for section 2. You should ask Siddiq Johar. He's fantastic at section 2, or any of the section 2 tutors. But for me, I got 61 in section 2, so like, yeah, he probably did better than I did. But yeah, resources that will help improve math estimations. For me, it was just doing questions, doing GAMSAT questions, and I would improve my math estimation through that. But if you wanted to, you could search up a whole range of different worksheets, like year 8, year 9 level worksheets. I had a couple of friends who did that. Year 8, year 9 level worksheets, and go through them, right? Go through the year 8, year 9 level worksheets. Don't use a calculator. There might be calculator based for the year 8, year 9s, but for you, don't do calculator. That's how you can help improve your math estimation. A lot of questions here. What to do if you don't know the approach you should take in mathematical reasoning questions? Okay, so the question here is what to do if you don't immediately know the approach. Okay, I guess the question is twofold then. How did I immediately know the approach that I'm supposed to take in mathematical reasoning questions? And then also, what to do if you don't know? Well, how I knew was because when I read through the STEM, I already made the dots. I identified all of the pieces of information. All I had to do was connect them, right? So that's the advantage of reading the STEM first and then doing the questions after. Right. Although the disadvantage is that you might run out of time because you're spending too much time per STEM and you don't have enough time for the questions. So you kind of have to balance whatever process works for you. So that's how I immediately know the approach. But if I don't immediately know the approach, often what I do is I try to look for a link. If I can't find the link, I give myself 30 to 45 seconds. If I don't find the link, that question is gone. I'm never thinking about it again. I'm never solving it. Gone, move on to the next question, get other questions right. That would be my approach there. Yep. So is the layout of the exam the same as the Fraser's question bank layout? It's very close. The layout of the exam, the way the exam looks like, it's very close to the Fraser's question bank as well. So I think that's really good too. Similar process of prep for section 1? Yes, basically. It's just reflection. But instead of you thinking about your skills of logical reasoning and problem solving, in section 2, it's more humanities, social awareness, and empathetic reasoning. Yeah. Think about the emotions behind the people that are talked about. When, for example, if you're given a poem and you want to analyze a poem, read the sentence, the stanza of the poem, read the context of the poem. The context will give you an information about the poetry itself, right? The context will help you think about the poem from the perspective of the person who wrote it, and then feel their position. Let's say it was Elizabeth in 1941, right? So Elizabeth, she's a woman, and she's in 1941. That is the World War era. She's gone out to all the men have gone out to the World War. She used to be suppressed because of, or oppressed due to the men having patriarchal kind of perspectives. But now that they're all gone, she had to come, pick up the slack, get society to continue functioning like most women did. So she's probably very ambitious. She's very loud and proud. She's happy about the fact that she's gotten more autonomy because the men have gone to war. That kind of thing, right? You see, that's what I mean by it's a different skill set, but it's the same process. Reflection is the same, but instead of you using logic, you're using emotion and empathy and understanding of individual social circumstance. So sharing my email, yes, I will 100% share my email here. Yeah. And then also, I guess, yeah, a little bit of feedback here. Type in the chat if you found this was helpful, and if you like this kind of format of seminar. If it's good, then we will continue doing things like this in the future. Okay, helpful, fantastic. Good to hear. Okay. Do you know if you're allowed to bring blank paper for working out? So they give you a whiteboard for you to be able to use there. Did you find yourself delegating your time evenly between the 3 sections? That's a really good question, Rowena. No, I don't recommend it. I will say I don't recommend not splitting your time evenly. But me, like, because it was my first sit, I wasn't really expecting to get the best score in the first sit. So I kind of went, if I put a little bit more time in section 3, then, because I enjoyed doing section 3. I didn't really enjoy section 2. Section 1 was fun. It was like not the most fun, but it was like kind of fun, right? Because it was multiple choice and I didn't have to write anything. So yeah, so I did delegate more time to section 3 than anything else, but which was reflected in my score, right? 97 section 3, 61 section 2, 71 section 1, right? So there you go. More time you spend in a particular section, of course, the higher you're going to get for it. The desk questions for section 3, easier or harder? The desk questions aren't really comparable. They do help you with developing the reasoning skills, so mathematical reasoning, contextual understanding, logical inference, all of those different skills. They help you with that, definitely, but they're not like the GAMSAT in the sense that they require more context, they require a little bit more prior knowledge. They're a little bit too different from the current state of the GAMSAT. So I wouldn't be able to say whether it's easier or harder. It just depends because the questions are very variable in DES themselves, but they are very good for developing your reasoning. They're just not reflective of what the GAMSAT's going to look like. If you implement these strategies in the next few weeks, do you think you can realistically get close to 90? It's a loaded question, Tatenda. Like, it really depends on where you're currently at. I think anything is possible. I've heard of some people that just studied for 2 weeks and ended up getting like high 80s for section 3, which is like, great. But yeah. So in terms of my email address, I'll just throw it in the chat. There you go. So you guys should have access to that now. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So do not give up on prep. You still have time. You can still do well. It's possible to prep in 6 weeks. It's not like it's be all and end all. 6 weeks is a lot of time. It's just you really have to, you really have to kind of isolate your time well. Okay. Yep. Hopefully that helps there. This one here. probably just do a few more questions. So stick around till 8:30 and then head off there. Okay. Juggling GAMSAT with uni for March sitting. Oof. I don't think there really is a need to juggle the GAMSAT study with uni, because in the March sitting, you've got like maybe 2 weeks of March. By that point, you would have already done, hopefully, a lot of preparation till then. But uni always starts really slow. So if I was you, or what I did, I just ditched uni for the first 2 weeks, knowing that I was gonna catch up. So I didn't do any uni at all, just the GAMSAT. Yeah, and then I caught up, because uni is like that. You're just able to catch up very quickly. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, my mistake. I didn't. I should have said it to everyone rather than that. So now you should be able to see my email. Okay, how do we go about answering a question we have no idea approach stuck on? Biggest thing, look for synonyms, look for key things in the question that are similar to the things in the stem. That's the first step. So if you got like a stem saying something about mass, and then you have so let's say the question says something about mass and the stem says something about weight. Okay, those two things seem very similar. You can connect those together, right? So that's one piece of advice I'd give for that. If you're completely stuck, look for synonyms. Look for relationships that are talking about a similar thing. I already answered that question. Would you recommend the ACER resources? Did I find them useful? I did all the ACER booklets, and I found that they were easier than the GAMSAT, easier than what I expected, but they were definitely useful in the sense that they helped me get an idea of the types of stems. So the stems within the ACER booklets are fantastic, by the way. You can make very difficult questions based on those stems, but for some reason they made the stems very difficult, but they made the questions easy. I didn't understand why, but that's, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of ACER, absolutely not. I'm speaking from my opinion, right, of what the ACER content is. Fix making silly mistakes. Identify the reason you're making the silly mistakes. The reasons for other people, many people are different. For me, making silly mistakes is because I'm rushing through it and I let the time pressure get to me. That's how I make silly mistakes, which is why I remove the pressure altogether by adopting that growth mindset. GAMSAT doesn't matter. It's an opportunity, or it's a problem solving session. That's what it is. That's all it is, right? And in doing so, the silly mistakes went because I wasn't stressed, right? So find the reason for your silly mistakes and you do that. So using and keeping, keeping track of my reflections, what I used. So what I used to keep track of my reflections was, initially it would be pen and paper. I had an exercise book probably in that shelf somewhere. It'll take too long to find it, but I had an exercise book, about 128 pages, where I just write down like my reflections in there. I had like the first 5 pages of the exercise book I kept for gems. Gems are like big things that I keep making mistakes for. I just write them down in that booklet. And then for the rest of them, I just kind of wrote down, oh, this is a specific point from this particular question. Question 7 from Fraser's Mock 2. This is what I did, right? So that's how I used to reflect. But then I got to a point where I was reflecting and I got so good at reflection that I didn't really need to keep track of it anymore, because I just incorporated the learnings directly into my subconscious. And I just remembered it in the next questions. So if you can get to that level, that's fantastic, right? Okay. All right. I think that's all of the questions so far. I might just stick around for a couple more minutes. If you have any big picture questions that come up, then that would be great. All righty. Okay, cool. Glad to hear though that most of you found this helpful. It was fantastic. That's the goal. There we go. I can stop sharing now. Okay, no worries. I'll stick around for just a few more minutes to get some of those. Yeah, so I did. So Arifin, just to give again a bit of a context, like I went like very ham on the GAMSAT. Like I committed my entire life for those few months to the GAMSAT. I don't recommend doing it, but it gets you. If it gets you the score, I mean, got me the score. I'm in med school now. I'm living the time of my life. I'm happy, right? But really is depends. So in terms of what questions I did 1,000, more than 1,000 questions, but across many different banks. I used some Fraser's mocks. I used Des O'Neill. I used the ACER papers, and that's it. I completed the Des O'Neill book end to end. I did as many Fraser's papers as I can get my hands on, and I did the ACER papers that I got from friends. So I didn't actually pay for anything through this whole process. I just did it. But yeah, like I really the Fraser stuff would really help me. would you suggest focusing on one section if it's your strength? It's not advice that I give to the average person, but if you're someone like me and you know in your bones that you'll get 100 for section 3 or close to it, then go for it. But if you don't know it, if you don't know it for 100% certainty that you're going to get an absolutely amazing score in the section, or you don't have a very high confidence in yourself, I'd probably say distribute it evenly, because if you did that and you didn't end up getting a good score, then you've kind of just wasted the entire set, right? So yeah. Yeah, okay. If you just want to rely on phrases, that's totally fine as well. Like again, it's not, you can use a myriad of different questions. You don't have to necessarily say, oh, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. It's entirely like up to you. As long as you understand the limitations of the bank that you're using, that's the most important. Recognize that the questions could be wrong, or you might have a little bit of a different way of solving it. Trust yourself, trust the logic that you applied to the questions. If it's a little bit of a different way, as long as it's correct, that's what matters, right? So yeah, that's the most important there. Oh, that's fantastic. Yes. So initially, that's exactly what I did. So Desanil kind of has that start where they say, "Oh, do this, do this, do this, do this." I initially did that, and then I realized the questions were a little bit, like they were a bit just not really testing logical reasoning all the time. It was a little bit content based as well, and I kind of thought, I still developed as much as I could. I took as much as I could from it, and then I went to did some of the phrases mocks, and I was like, whoa, this is fantastic, right? These questions are like exactly based on logic. They're very similar to like what the ACES booklet's saying that's being tested. So that was great. So yeah. But yeah, I did the way that they said to do the questions, and I found that was also very helpful. So if you want to use that, you can. Yeah. How do you know you need help from a Section 3 tutor? That's a fantastic question. If you find trouble reflecting, I think is probably the most important thing, because often people come to Section 3 private tutors and say, "Oh, help me do well in physics," and at that point I'm like, oh, I can't help you because your criteria is too broad, mate. So yeah, like if you find trouble reflecting and you find trouble identifying your problems, maybe running them through a tutor would help you identify your problems better. That's probably the tip that I give there. Alrighty, so with that, I think we'll probably end this webinar. Thank you guys so much for attending, especially for those of you who stayed on till the end. Really, really appreciate it. Hope everything we talked about was helpful. And just remember, at the end of the day, you can sit this exam so many times. The most important thing is your GPA, because after the 3 years, you'd have to sit another bachelor's if your GPA was abysmal, like below 4, then you'd have to like sit another course. So don't sacrifice GPA for the purpose of the GAMSAT, because you could sit the GAMSAT a total of 10 times until your GPA expires, and the GAMSAT's eligible for 4 years. So you can sit the GAMSAT, sorry, a total of 20 times over 10 years, and 8 for the next 4 years. If you get a GAMSAT score that's good in the next 4 years, in other words, you've got 8 GAMSAT sits, and even if one of those scores is good, you'll be able to get into medicine from that. Yeah. What was my GPA? Yeah, so my GPA was a 7. Yeah. Okay. So if there's any questions I want to be asked outside of the recording, I can stop the recording there. And thank you everyone for coming, but I'll stop the recording here. Hopefully that was helpful.